Okay, I have a quieter keyboard, so hopefully that is a little easier for those of you watching the episode. We'll see. Welcome back to PS Admin. I am Mark, the PowerShell admin. Today we have part 2 on hash tables in PowerShell. You might recall previously we had an episode, part 1 was hash tables. PowerShell hash tables are rad and you should learn them. So if you're still new to PowerShell hash tables, you haven't seen that episode, I would actually recommend watching that one first. There's a link in the description. But today's episode, what we're going to talk about is hash tables and select object, because it wasn't really until I learned about hash tables and select object together when I was still learning the language that I felt like I had mastery over the language rather than being at the mercy of it and the mercy of the default objects that the built-in commandlets and other data sources were exposing. If I wanted to run a report, or I wanted to take the output from one commandlet and pipe it to the input of another commandlet, sometimes I didn't know how to get there from here. But it was finally using these technologies together, hash table type and select object, that allowed me to do that. So and let's actually be clear, hash tables were made for select object, and select object was made for hash tables. They are PowerShell BFFs, and if you learn them really well, hopefully you enjoy helping people, because it will likely make you the reports rock star on your team, and they're going to come to you because you can bang out in like 5 minutes a report that used to take an hour. So with great power comes great responsibility, right? As all true nerds know. So let's come up with an example that will help us illustrate this. And just so you know, there are going to be two kind of major side topics we're going to go into that, while they're not really strictly hash tables or select object, I guarantee you, as you're learning the language and as you learn PowerShell more, as you learn to use it in your work, that these will be useful to you. So let's come up with an example. If you don't know what an Outlook OST file is, then lucky you. It is a cache file that is stored locally in the user profile on a computer. It's stored by Outlook that saves recent or commonly accessed mailbox items like emails, file attachments, calendar items, those kinds of things. And the thing with these files is they can get big. So let's, for the sake of example, let's suppose that our boss wants a report of all the OST files on the network on these user computers and how large they are. So we have some data. It might be how we ran the report here, and you can see that it's got the file name, the last write time, which is modified date. The full name has the UNC path in it. And so what our boss really wants is he wants a way to tie computer or mailbox to file size. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take this length attribute, which is what's returned when we use get item or get child item, and we're going to convert that to something human readable. And then we'll take, because it doesn't take very long, we'll take the file name and we're going to chop off this extension and use just the mailbox name, which is probably the primary SMTP of that mailbox. So there's two pieces of information that our boss or our boss's boss can use to contextualize this data. Who is it and how large is that file? And this is all play data that I generated. It's not from any real environment, but this should look approximately, these are the main attributes that we would be working with. So let's go ahead and let's look at the first line of data here. And we can see that it has this length attribute. So the first major side topic we're going to get into is file sizes. And usually in PowerShell or in .NET, when we're talking about file sizes, it's going to be the file size in bytes. And PowerShell has some handy built-in ways to convert from bytes to megabytes or gigabytes, or actually rather to convert from a number of gigabytes or megabytes and multiply it to the number of bytes. But we can work backwards by dividing. So let's say I want to know how many bytes is 5 gigabytes. Well, I can just type 5 GB and it will tell me how many bytes that is. So for these values, what I want to do is divide by 1 of those gigabyte values. So if I divide the file length by 1 GB, it gives me the total number of gigabytes for that file. And actually, let's use this more recent one here, the last item, or the first item. And if I divide that by 1 GB, then I get this 1.75, et cetera, et cetera. Now, so that's how we can work with the bytes or the megabytes or whatever the denomination is that we want. But we also know that we probably want to round this number off. So that's actually going to be the second kind of major subtopic here that we deal with, is rounding in PowerShell. The simplest way to round is simply to typecast as an integer. So we put in parentheses that value we just calculated, and then we place the type integer before it, and that will cast it to a whole number integer. But that's not very precise. Maybe we want to round, but we don't want to round all the way to the whole number. In this case, I think to the nearest 1/10 of a gigabyte would be the most helpful. So for that, we have a math type in .NET, and it's got a lot of really helpful methods that we can use to perform common math functions. It also has a couple static values like pi. So if you want an easy reference to pi, there you go. In this case, we want to do some rounding. So if we look at the overload definitions, we'll see that there is it'll take a decimal or a double. And there's some other options that we'll get to momentarily. But let's go back. So instead of casting it as an integer, we're going to use the math round method, and that produces the same value. To round to a decimal place, we supply another parameter. So I want 1 decimal place. So I put in the same thing, then comma 1 within the parentheses to supply the digits parameter. And so now I have that this number of bytes is approximately 1.8 gigabytes. So that's very helpful. As an aside here with rounding, you might expect from your high school math class that when you round, you are always, and you get to a 0.5, something that's exactly in the middle of the whole number below it and above it, or the place if it's further down, like the hundredths, right? It's exactly between the 10th place above and below it. You might expect that it will always round it like you did in high school, which is up, where 0.5, would round up to 1. But that's not actually the case by default in PowerShell, and we'll explain why and how to change that momentarily. So midpoints, let's just demonstrate really quick. So this is a collection of 0.5 to 5.5, and we're going to round each object just to illustrate what happens. So here on each item, we're just using the math round method, and we're going to round it. And as you can see, it is a little bit unexpected. It rounds 0.5 down to 0, 1.5 up to 2, 2.5 down to 2. So you get this kind of jagged series of numbers here. And now that looks really unnatural, but you have to also realize that this is only because it's exactly 0.5, 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, etc. So if we were plotting points on a line, this probably would not be ideal. Now, what this is when we round, if you look back up here, it has this parameter called system.midpoint.rounding mode, and there's 2 options there. The default is to even. So what it's doing is when it hits a midpoint, it's exactly between the 2 numbers that you're asking it to round to one or the other of. It's going to go to the even number. So that's why 0.5 rounds down, because 0 is even. But 1.5 rounds up to 2 rather than down to 1, which is odd. The other option, of course, is away from 0, and that's probably what you're used to in your math class. If we want to go back and round and use that method, we can, and then now we get what looks to us like a more even distribution. Now the reason that it does this by default, it rounds to 0, or sorry, not away from 0, but the way it rounds to the nearest even is so that you get better statistical averages or a sum. Like if you were to round a series of test scores and then you wanted the average, it would actually slightly bias high, because anytime you're splitting a 0.5, a midpoint number, you're going up. So it probably, your average will be slightly higher given enough values than what it would be if you were to use a more even distribution of rounding. And so that's what the that's what the to even rounding, midpoint rounding mode seeks to do, is make it a little more even distribution. So if you're doing statistics, maybe use the default. If you're plotting a line like Bresnahan's line algorithm, maybe then you want to use the away from 0 method. For our purposes, it doesn't matter for file sizes. So now that we know how to take a number of bytes and convert it to gigabytes in a readable format, let's see how we do that in the pipeline so that we can create reports that happen all in one motion and that we could schedule or that we could quickly modify. So you're probably familiar with select object, and you probably use it to rearrange the order of properties and select just those that you absolutely need. So if we take our data, likely what we would be selecting in this case would be the name and the file length in bytes. So what we can do is replace length with a hash table, and we can create that hash table to, sorry, Kloopy. Actually, let's just have to stop it. What we're going to do is fashion that hash table so that it's the property name and the value are what we're looking for. So we do that with 2 key value pairs in the hash table. The first key value pair defines the name of the property. The second one defines how we calculate the value. So for the name, we can abbreviate it to n equals, and then in this case, since we're doing the size in gigabytes, we're going to call it size GB. So that way when our boss or our boss's boss reads this, he'll know exactly what that number is referring to. It's not megabytes, it's gigabytes, definitely not terabytes. And then we put in a semicolon, and then now E, which is short for expression. And what we're going to do is we're going to use that to create a value for that, size. And so we're going to take that math type and we're going to round $_.length divided by 1 gigabyte, comma 1. So we want it to go to the 10ths place. And then now we get these nice values here. We could also replace name at this point and use a little bit of regular expressions, and maybe we would call it the mailbox name or mailbox if we want something that's a little more meaningful to our boss, right? So we're replacing name with the mailbox, and then we're going to take that name value, but we're going to use a little regular expressions to whack off the OST on the end, which I think could be like that. So now we have a report that maybe makes a little more sense to our boss, and there's nothing else to sort it by, so we'll sort it by the size GB. And at this point, we could probably export it to a CSV file, OST size.csv, no type information, never type information. And we could do it, could not find, I don't even have a temp folder on this computer. So that's what's going on. But you get the idea. And actually, if this is another side note, I'll put this also in the link to the description. But if you really want some nice reports and you want to do them all in PowerShell, there is a fantastic module called Import Excel, which will give you some very decent options to export straight to an XLSX file. It's a little bit slow, but if you're scheduling a task or you're doing it all in PowerShell anyway, it's nice because you can run the same report every day, every hour, not every minute, because again, it's a little slow, but you get very consistent results. And so I'm going to put that in a link in the description if you're wanting to make some really nice reports and not have to do a lot of work. Import Excel is a fantastic module. But you know what? Let's take care of these errors. You know, this is one of the joys, right? So anyhow, you know, I really enjoy making these videos for you. It's my hope that someone out there finds something useful that they can take with them back to work, or maybe back to their next job, or into an interview for their next job. If so, just, you know, leave a comment down below. I'd really appreciate hearing back from you. But in the meantime, I've been Mark, the PowerShell admin, and keep the shell fun. Take care.